Oak Haven, Wyoming Territory, December 1888. Her trembling fingers reached for the third button. A hand caught her wrist firm. Not cruel. He buttoned the flannel back himself. Eyes burning. I don't buy human beings. Under God's sky, no man owns another's body or soul. You owe me nothing, only yourself a life lived with dignity. 16 days she'd held herself together. She broke. Stay with us. This is where the story begins. The rain came down with ice in its teeth. It wasn't snow yet. It was that miserable in-between freezing drizzle that coated every surface in a thin, treacherous skin and pinged off the iron stovepipes above the storefronts like distant rifle shots. A cold, steady rhythm, relentless, the kind of sound that drilled into your skull after a while and made you feel like the sky itself was taunting you. Maeve Ross stood on top of a whiskey barrel. She had been standing there for 6 minutes. She knew because she'd been counting the seconds in her head, one by one, forcing herself to stay present instead of drowning in the hot black shame that kept rising behind her eyes. The crowd below her wasn't large. 20 men, maybe. A few women at the fringes who'd crept out of the dry goods store to stare. The mud on Oak Haven's thoroughfare was ankle-deep and gray-brown, and the men who'd gathered didn't seem troubled by it. They never were when there was something worth watching. Oak Haven, Wyoming Territory, December 1888. The town smelled like it always had, sour mash seeping through the saloon walls, wet horse manure, wood smoke hanging low in the cold air. But today those smells had mixed with something else. Something Maeve couldn't name exactly. She could only feel it pressing down on her shoulders like a hand. Corbin Mercer stood off to her left, beside the saloon's hitching post. He wore a clean coat. That detail bothered her more than anything else about this moment. Pressed lapels, polished boots, a watch chain, catching what little light existed under the overcast sky. He had the composed, unbothered look of a man who had reduced a human being to a dollar amount before and found the process entirely unremarkable. He was watching her with flat, patient eyes. $112, he called out to the crowd. His voice was smooth, practiced. Miss Ross is well-built and able-bodied. She reads and writes. Her late father was a land surveyor, so she comes with some education. He let that settle a beat. Contracted labor, full season, starting immediately. Maeve kept her chin level. Her father had been dead 16 days. 16 days since the mine accident that the sheriff had written up as a cave-in, though nobody had gone back to inspect the supports, and nobody seemed inclined to do so. 16 days since she'd packed what little food remained in their claim shack, gathered Jasper and Bodie, and walked the frozen trail into Oak Haven to figure out what came next. Mercer had been waiting for her at the land office the following morning. He'd laid a paper across the desk with her father's name printed at the top and a $100 debt printed below it. A loan, he said. Payment due. Interest compounded. She had never seen that paper before in her life. Her father had never mentioned a loan from Corbin Mercer. Not once. But the paper carried a notary's seal. And the bank ledger Mercer showed the clerk backed it up, right there in black ink, tidy as a Sunday hymnal. Maeve had spent a week trying to contest it. The circuit judge was in Cheyenne. The county clerk wouldn't see her. The sheriff scratched the back of his neck and said, debt collection matters weren't in his jurisdiction. Dead end after dead end. 16 days of them. Then Mercer had appeared at her boarding house door, with 2 men standing behind him in the hallway, and he'd explained that if she couldn't settle the debt by Friday, her brothers Jasper, 13 years old, and Bodie, who had just turned 8, would be transported to the county orphanage workhouse in Laramie on Monday's stage. He'd said it pleasantly, the same calm voice a man uses ordering his dinner. So here she stood, on a barrel, in the freezing rain. 112, Mercer repeated to the crowd. Any advance? A bearded man near the front looked her over slowly. She fixed her gaze on a point above his hat and held it there. Behind Mercer, at the corner of the saloon's front window, She caught a flash of movement. Jasper's pale face. He had slipped around from the alley where she'd told him to stay, and he stood very still now, watching her from the edge of the boardwalk. She could see from the set of his jaw that he was fighting hard not to cry. Bodie was tucked under his arm, face half buried in Jasper's coat. That was what cracked her open a little. Not the crowd. Not Mercer's voice calling out her worth in dollar amounts. Jasper's jaw, her 13-year-old brother clenching his teeth because he believed he should be the one protecting her and could not figure out how. She would not cry. She pressed her fingernails into her palm, inside her coat pocket. She would not. 115 from the gentleman in the back. Mercer nodded, made a note, looked up again. Do I hear 20? The freezing rain ticked against the iron roof, over the saloon porch. Water ran down the back of Maeve's collar. Her feet had gone numb below the ankle, boots soaked through. But she stood straight because that was the only thing left that was entirely hers. She heard the mules before she saw them. A slow, rhythmic clinking of iron bells, the creak and groan of heavy load rigging. Big hooves picking careful steps through the frozen mud. Two-pack mules came around the north end of the thoroughfare, loaded deep bundled furs, iron traps, canvas-wrapped supplies stacked high and lashed tight. Behind them, on a plain brown horse, rode a man. He was large, not tall exactly, but built through the chest and shoulders, like a man who'd done hard physical labor his entire life and made peace with it. He wore a heavy canvas coat over flannel, a hat dark with rain, and a beard that had not seen a razor recently. A rifle rode in the scabbard at his knee. He pulled up at the edge of the crowd. He sat there a moment. He looked at Maeve on the barrel. Then he looked at Mercer. Then he dismounted, tied his horse at the post, and walked through the crowd without hurrying. Men shifted out of his path without being asked. He stopped in front of Mercer's table. "What's the figure?" he said. His voice was low and even. Mercer looked him over. Contracted labor, debt recovery. 100. The man pulled a leather pouch from inside his coat and dropped it on the table. It landed heavy, the unmistakable dense clank of gold. He untied the cord and tipped a portion onto the surface. Double eagle gold pieces, $20 coins. 7 of them, then several smaller gold pieces alongside. "Count 150 out of that," he said. The crowd had gone quiet. Even the freezing rain seemed to ease up a notch. Mercer's pleasant expression held, but something shifted behind his eyes. This is a legitimate debt collection proceeding. You can't simply walk up and... The hunting knife came out of the man's belt and drove into the table with a solid final thunk. The blade buried itself 2 inches into the wood and stood there, trembling faintly. "Count the money." His voice hadn't risen at all. "And send someone for the mayor. Because before I pull that knife out of your table, you are going to sign a full release on this debt, witnessed in front of the mayor and every man standing here. And those 2 boys at the corner of this building walk free today. Right now. In front of witnesses." He said all of this, looking at Mercer, not at Maeve, not at the crowd. Just Mercer, steady and direct, with the particular patience of a man who has already decided what is going to happen, and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. Mercer was quiet for a long beat. His eyes moved to the coins, to the knife, to the face of the man in front of him. "Mayor's in the barber shop," someone in the crowd offered. Mercer straightened his lapels. "Fine," he said quietly. "We'll call it settled." It took 11 minutes. The mayor arrived with shaving soap still on one side of his jaw. Mercer signed the release paper with a pen he gripped hard, his knuckles pale. The mayor witnessed it. The barber, who'd followed him out, witnessed it. 3 men from the crowd stepped forward, without being asked, and put their names on the paper too. When it was done, the man pulled his knife from the table and turned to look at Maeve for the first time. She was still on the barrel. He walked over and held up one hand, not dramatic, just practical, the same way you'd offer a hand to someone stepping down from a wagon. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it and stepped off. Her boots hit the frozen mud. Her knees weren't quite steady. but she locked them. "My brothers," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Go get them," he said. He was already turning back toward his mules. She heard Jasper and Bodie. Before she turned, boots splashing hard through the mud, Bodie's short legs working double time to keep up. She stood still another moment. She watched the broad back of this stranger, who had just spent $150 of his own money on a debt that wasn't his problem, asked nothing, and was now checking his mule's cinch straps as if this had all been a minor inconvenience in his afternoon. Nobody did that. In her experience, nobody did anything without a price attached. She pressed her nails harder into her palm. She would not cry. Not here, not in front of Mercer's crowd and Mercer's flat watching eyes, but her chin dipped just once before she caught it. Not yet. The man's name was Garrett Sterling. That was what the mayor had written on the release paper before the ink dried. Maeve had read every word of that document while Mercer's pen was still scratching across the bottom, keeping her eyes down so nobody noticed her reading. She hadn't thanked him. Not properly. Back in the mud of the thoroughfare, with the freezing rain starting back up, and Bodie's face pressed into her coat, and Jasper standing too rigid for a boy his age, the word had caught somewhere in her throat, and she'd let it stay there. They left Oak Haven within 20 minutes of the signing. He didn't say, "Are you ready?" He finished his business with the liveryman, checked the lashing on both mules, and started north up the trail that ran along the creek before climbing hard into the mountains. Maeve gathered the boys and followed because there was nowhere else to go. She carried one canvas bag. Everything they owned was in it, 3 changes of clothes, her father's field journal wrapped in oilskin, a tintype photograph, and $12 stitched into the lining of her coat since the night her father died. She also carried, closed in her right fist, inside her coat pocket, a small folding knife. 3-inch blade, she'd taken it from a hardware store window ledge 3 days ago when she'd had no money and no clear plan, but had known she needed something to hold on to. She was not naive. She'd grown up on the frontier, and she'd heard enough stories about charitable strangers to understand that the story usually changed once the witnesses were gone. Whatever Garrett Sterling expected in return for $150, she intended to be ready for it. She would get her brothers ahead on the trail first. Then she would handle whatever came next. That was the plan. The trail climbed almost immediately. Oak Haven sat in the valley bottom, and the country north of it rose steeply through pine and bare aspen, switchbacking up through loose rockfall, before leveling briefly and then climbing again. The frozen creek ran alongside for the first mile, its surface gray-white with a thread of black water still moving below. The mule bells clinked in slow, clear rhythm, marking time when the wind died and cutting through it. When the wind rose, she knew that sky. She'd spent enough winters in mountain country to read what it was building toward. The low green-gray cast sitting over the northwestern ridge meant a system coming in fast. Something serious. She said nothing about it. A half-mile out, she realized her feet had moved past cold into something more worrying. Her boots were secondhand, a full size too large, and the lining had soaked through in Oak Haven's mud and sleet. Each step pressed wet wool against skin that had stopped registering normal sensation. She kept walking. She was good at that. Beside her, Bodie had gone silent. He was 8 years old, and under ordinary circumstances, he produced commentary on everything around him without effort or pause. But he was quiet now, legs working double time to match the mule's stride, chin tucked into his collar, not looking up. Garrett stopped the mules. He came back along the near mule's flank, crouched in front of Bodie, and looked at the boy's boots, thin, cracked leather, no insulation worth the word. Then he stood and looked at Maeve. "Let me see your feet." "They're fine." He waited. "I said they're fine, Mr. Sterling." He stepped forward without further discussion, crouched in the snow, and took hold of her left boot at the toe and heel. She was too surprised to pull back. He bent the sole once, sharply. and water wrung out of the crease in a visible stream. He stood. Up, he said, and gestured at the near mule at the gap between the front supply pack and the rear one. She looked at it properly for the first time. It wasn't a large space, but it was deliberate. The packs had been positioned that way on purpose. Whoever sat between them would be sheltered on three sides. He'd loaded the mule like that before he'd even spoken to her, before he'd known anyone was coming with him. She held onto that piece of information and said nothing. "I am not riding a mule like cargo," she said. "You can ride it like cargo, or I can carry you like cargo," he said. "Either way. Lose those feet and you're no good to your brothers." He looked at Bodhi. "Boy, you're riding too." Bodhi glanced at Maeve. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the gap between the packs. She thought about her feet, the miles ahead, the boys. She nodded. Garrett lifted Bodhi first easily, with both hands, settling the boy between the packs before Bodhi even had time to look nervous. Bodhi grabbed a lashing strap and held on. Then Garrett turned to Maeve. She didn't take the offered hand, but she used the stirrup and pulled herself up, working herself into the gap. The packs were solid on both sides, buffalo hide on the left and canvas-wrapped steel traps on the right, and the wind that had been cutting through her dress all morning simply stopped. The temperature difference was immediate. Garrett shrugged off his coat without ceremony. It was enormous, heavy grizzly hide. The fur turned inward against thick wool canvas on the outside. He folded it once and handed it up to her, without looking for acknowledgement. She took it and wrapped it around herself and Bodhi, pulling the fur up to the boy's chin. Bodhi burrowed against her side and made a small, settled sound. Garrett clicked his tongue at the lead mule, and they moved. The bells rang again, softer, now as snow began falling in earnest. She watched him from the gap between the packs. He moved at a steady, deliberate pace, not hurrying and not dawdling. He checked each bend of the trail before committing to it, scanned the slopes above them at every opening in the trees. At a creek crossing 2 miles up, the ice at the center looked thin, and he tested it with his heel before waving them through, watching the mule cross one careful step at a time before following last. At a section of overhanging snow above the trail, he stopped them, brought them through one at a time quickly, took the rear position himself. He wasted nothing. Not a step, not a word, not a motion. Her right hand was still in her coat pocket. The knife was there. She wasn't gripping it as hard as she had been when they left town, but she hadn't put it down. She was gathering information. She was watching. She would make a decision about the knife when she understood more about what kind of man this was. An hour up, Jasper stumbled over a root buried under the snow and caught himself on one knee. He was back on his feet before anyone could react, brushing snow off his coat with sharp, decisive movements that made clear he required no assistance. But she saw the look that moved through him before he got the mask back on. The hollow, depleted look. He had been running on nerve all day, and the nerve was running thin. He was 13. He was trying to be older than that, and she loved him for it. And she wished he didn't feel like he had to. Garrett had stopped a few yards ahead. He was looking at Jasper. "Come up here," he said. Jasper came. Garrett pointed at the trail surface. "Tell me what you see." Jasper looked snow at the edge, where it meets that pine root. A pause. Jasper crouched down. Tracks, snowshoe hairs, 3, maybe 4, going east, upslope or down. Jasper looked more carefully. Upslope, back, feet dug in hard, moving fast. Good. Now look at the pine bark, about 4 feet up. Jasper straightened and looked. Scratch marks. Cougar's been working that tree. Scent marking. That's what pushed those hairs upslope instead of the easy way down. Garrett started walking, speaking as he went. Trail talk, that's what old trappers called it. The mountain keeps a record of everything that passes through. Every animal leaves its mark. Learn to read it, and you know what's ahead of you on the ridge before you're standing in it. Jasper moved up alongside him, closer to the mule's shoulder. His eyes were on the snow surface now instead of his own feet. "How old are those cat marks?" "Yesterday or the day before. Saps dried in the cold, Not fresh enough to concern us tonight. He pointed ahead. Watch the right side of the trail from here. More hare runs as we climb. They like the open meadow above tree line. Jasper's eyes went to the snow and stayed there. 10 minutes passed. Two sets here, Jasper said, going left around that boulder. Good. Another 10 minutes. Deer trail crossing ours. Wide, used regular. What does that tell you? Jasper worked through it. Water somewhere close. Deer don't stray far from water. There's a spring a quarter-mile west. Comes up warm from underground, stays open all winter. We cut right at that lightning-struck trunk ahead. The ridge path is sheltered. No use fighting the valley wind. He didn't look at the boy. You've got a good eye, Jasper said nothing. But something had come back into how he was carrying himself, a small thing, but visible. The set of his shoulders had changed. Maeve watched from the mule and didn't say anything. Her father had taught her geology the same way, pointing, asking, waiting for her to look carefully before he told her what she was seeing. That kind of patience wasn't common. She turned the observation over and filed it away because it was information, and right now information was the most valuable thing she had. The snow fell harder. The light was thinning fast, the short December day making its exit without ceremony. The trail bent into a corridor of old-growth pine, where the canopy was dense enough to hold back most of the snowfall. And in there, the wind dropped, and the bells went soft and quiet, and Bodhi's weight against her side grew heavier as he drifted into sleep. Near the top of the sheltered corridor, Jasper slipped on an iced-over trail crossing and went down harder, both knees, hands out. He got up without help, didn't make a sound. Garrett kept moving, but after a moment, not looking back, he said, "You know what I learned the first winter I spent in these mountains?" Jasper was wiping snow from his palms onto his coat, listening. "Spent 3 days solid, trying to get angry enough at the cold to push through it," Garrett said. "Wind doesn't move for anger. Cold doesn't hear it." He stepped over a buried windfall root without breaking stride. "Raging at the weather won't keep you warm, kid. Only taking the next step keeps your heart beating." He said it like a fact, like something he'd learned the hard way and verified enough times that it didn't require elaboration. Then he kept walking. Jasper pulled his coat tighter and followed. Maeve pressed her cheek briefly against the top of Bodhi's sleeping head. She watched Jasper's back ahead on the trail, the way he was moving now. Something had come back into him. The snow kept coming. The light kept fading. The bells kept their slow rhythm, muffled and steady. Garrett pointed up through the trees first, a dark shape against the gray slope, a steep roofline heavy with snow, a stone chimney. "There," he said. Maeve looked up at it. She pressed her nails once into her palm to stay present. Then she fixed her eyes on the shape through the snow and let the mule bells carry them the last of the way in. The cabin had been here a long time. She could see it in the logs, massive timber, dark with age and years of pine pitch, soaking into the grain. The chinking between them was tight and well-maintained, the kind that had to be worked through many hard winters to hold that well against cold like this. The roof was steeply pitched, and the snowpack on it was even and deep, which meant the whole structure was solid. Underneath, no sag, no lean. A stone chimney climbed the north wall. A roofed porch covered the front door, shallow but properly built. On the east side, a lean-to sheltered a woodpile stacked head-high, enough cordwood to winter. One person alone for months, one person. Maeve noted that and kept it. A second lean-to on the west side served as a stable low-walled, rope-fenced across the front, hay under a canvas cover in the corner. Garrett unhitched the mules there in the dark while the last gray light went out of the sky completely. Jasper held a lantern without being asked, moving it where Garrett needed it, watching how the man checked each hoof with his thumbnail before letting the animal stand. Learning without being told, he was learning. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold ash and pine resin and the particular mineral sharpness of high-altitude air. Maeve carried Bodhi in, since the boy had gone completely limp with sleep in the final quarter mile, and she laid him near the cold fireplace and looked around in the dark. Stone hearth on the north wall, large and practical. An iron cookstove beside it. A rough-hewn table with 2 stools. A single iron-framed bed in the far corner, piled with blankets and furs. A row of iron pegs near the door carrying coats, traps, leather straps, all in deliberate order. A shelf above the fireplace holding oil tins, a compass, a worn Bible with a cracked spine, small tools and objects she couldn't make out without light. 1 bed. She filed that information without reacting to it. Garrett came in with an armload of split wood and had a fire going in the hearth in 4 minutes flat. Birch bark first, then loose kindling, then the larger pieces arranged around the outside, 1 match. He didn't rush and he didn't fiddle. He just did it, and it caught. An orange light flooded the room and drove the cold back toward the walls. He put water on the cookstove without announcing it. He found wool socks in a chest by the far wall and set them near the fire to warm. He did all of this in silence, without looking to see if anyone was watching. When the water was ready, he set a tin basin on the hearthstone and looked at Bodie, who Jasper had woken and steered over. "Boots off," he said. Bodie unlaced his boots and peeled off his socks. His feet were pale and mottled, the color that comes just before frostbite takes hold. Garrett lowered both small feet into the basin carefully, and Bodie flinched at first, and then went loose with relief as the warmth worked its way up through the cold. "Not too hot?" Garrett said. "No, sir. It's good." When Bodie was done, Jasper sat down and took his turn with the quiet defiance of a boy who needed help and didn't want anyone to notice he was accepting it. Feet in the basin, eyes on the fire. Then they both looked at Maeve. "I'm fine," she said. Nobody argued. Garrett went back outside to check the mule shelter against the storm that was hitting the mountain in full force. Now she could hear it against the walls, deep pressure, wind driving through the pine canopy above, snow in volleys against the window glass. Inside, the fire was taking hold, and the room was warming faster than she expected. She put both boys in the bed. Bodie was gone before his head hit the pillow. Jasper lay on his back with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and Maeve sat beside him on the edge of the mattress. "Is he going to want something?" Jasper said. "Low, careful." Maeve looked at him. "For bringing us up here," Jasper said. "The money, the $150. I'm going to handle it, Maeve." "Jasper." She put her hand on his arm, firm. "Sleep. That is what you are going to do right now. You hear me?" He held her eyes another moment. Then he turned onto his side, and within 2 minutes his breathing had slowed and deepened, and he was gone completely. Exhaustion taking him down all at once, the way it takes a young body when there's truly nothing left to run on. She stood. Garrett came back in, shook the snow off his shoulders, pulled off his outer coat, and hung it on a peg. He went to the stove and poured coffee into a tin cup, then settled onto the near stool with his back to her and his elbows on his knees and his hands wrapped around the cup. Maeve stood in the center of the room. She had been thinking about this for 6 miles of mountain trail, the whole way up through the snow and the wind, while Bodie slept against her side, and the mule bells measured out the distance, and Garrett's grizzly coat held the cold at bay. She had been running the calculation. She'd had time to run it many times over. $150. No notarized paper naming the debt, which meant it sat undefined, which was its own kind of pressure. She understood what she had to offer. She was 20 years old and able-bodied, and she'd been described publicly as well-built and educated. And she was not a child, and she was not foolish. She understood what men heard in those words. She'd been watching them hear it her entire life. Better to take it on her own terms. Better to be the one who named the terms first, before they were named for her. She could do this. She had done harder things in the past 16 days. She set her jaw and reached up for the top button of her flannel shirt. Her hands weren't quite steady. A fine trembling she put down to cold, but she worked the button through. The second button, she was reaching for the third when the hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, completely firm. She looked up. Garrett was standing in front of her. She hadn't heard him cross the room. His face was not what she'd been bracing for, not what she'd been preparing for, and trying to get ahead of the whole journey up the mountain. There was no appetite in it, no entitlement. What was there was anger, clean and contained, the kind she recognized from watching her father's face the time a land agent tried to alter the boundary on their claim survey. That anger hadn't been aimed at her father. It had been aimed at what was being done. This wasn't aimed at her either. He pulled the flannel together with his free hand. His fingers were steady and deliberate. He worked the second button back through its hole, then the first. He took one step back. I bought a rotten paper debt to rid us of Mercer. His voice was low, but iron ran through it. I don't buy human beings. He held her gaze, and being seen that directly not looked at, seen was something she hadn't been prepared for. Under God's sky, no man owns another's body or soul. You owe me nothing. You only owe yourself a life, lived with dignity. The fire cracked behind him. Wind drove snow hard against the window. Maeve opened her mouth. She had something prepared. A line of reasoning she'd constructed somewhere around mile 3, something that explained the logic clearly and kept her in control of how this went. It didn't come. She stood there with her shirt buttoned and his hand no longer on her wrist, and the room very warm and very quiet. And the thing she'd been holding since her father died, that rigid, constructed, carefully maintained thing built out of pure necessity and sheer stubborn, will simply gave way. Not slowly. Like a plank snapping under weight it was never built to hold. She was on the floor. She didn't know exactly how she'd gotten there. Her knees had simply stopped doing their work, and she was sitting on the rough plank floor with her back against the table leg, and she was crying. Not the quiet kind, not the managed, dignified kind with a handkerchief. She was crying from somewhere deep in her chest, ragged and unstoppable, and she pressed the back of her hand over her mouth and it helped nothing at all. She stopped trying to make it help. She cried for her father, for the man who had been careful and smart and decent and was dead anyway. In a mine collapse, nobody had bothered to inspect because inspecting it wouldn't have served Corbin Mercer's interests. She cried for the barrel in the freezing rain and the crowd watching her stand on it, and Mercer's pressed lapels and his flat, patient eyes that had looked at her and seen only a number. She cried for Jasper's jaw, set like a man's jaw, 13 years old and holding himself together because he believed that was what she needed from him. She cried for $12 stitched into a coat lining and a 3-inch folding knife taken from a window ledge, and all the other small, desperate calculations a person accumulates when those are the only tools available. She cried until she was shaking, until her breath came in broken pieces, until her face was wet and hot and completely past her ability to manage, and she gave up on managing it. Garrett moved to the hearth. He turned his stool to face the fire and sat down with his elbows on his knees and his tin cup in both hands. He looked at the fire, not at her. He didn't say it's all right. He didn't say calm down, you'll wake the boys. He didn't lean toward her, and he didn't lean away. He sat by the fire and let the room hold what it was holding, without making any demand that it become something easier. The fire burned. Wind pressed the walls. From the bed in the corner, Bodie shifted in his sleep and went still again. After a while, the crying became something quieter, then quieter than that, then just breathing, slow and unsteady, finding its way back. Maeve put her back against the table leg and drew her knees up and looked at the fire. Garrett looked at the fire. Outside, the blizzard was working the mountain in full. The sound of it was enormous deep pressure against the logs, wind running through the pines above, with a sound like a river in flood. The cabin received all of it without moving. These walls had been holding a long time. My father built his first claim shack in 20 below, Maeve said. She wasn't sure what made her say it. Her voice came out rough and scraped. Dug the footings himself, said a man who understood how rocks layered, understood everything about how to build something that holds, a beat of quiet. He was right, Garrett said. She reached into her pocket. The folding knife was there. She took her hand back out without it and rested it on her knee. I wasn't going to let that happen to my brothers, she said. Whatever else had to happen instead. Not that. I know, he said. She looked at him then. At the sight of his face in the firelight, the heavy jaw, and the scar along his left cheekbone, she hadn't noticed before now. He was looking at the fire with the expression of a man who had his own accounting of things he'd done to hold something he loved together, and who understood exactly what that kind of accounting cost over time. Why did you really do it? She said. The 150. He turned the tin cup in his hands. Mercer's been running that same scheme for years, he said. Paper debt that can't be contested. Labor contracts that amount to something else. He was quiet a moment. I've got my own reasons to want his business complicated. He looked at the fire, and I watched you stand on that barrel for 6 minutes in the freezing rain and not let them see you cry. She said nothing to that. The fire settled. A log dropped and sent a brief shower of sparks up the flue. Garrett reached to the side and added another split, working it in without getting up. Bed's yours, he said. You and the boys. I'll take the floor. You don't need to. It's my floor, he said. I know every splinter in it. It wasn't exactly a joke, but it landed close enough to something like one that she almost said something back, and then didn't. She got up. Her legs were stiff, and her eyes were swollen, and the walk across the room felt like something requiring more than she had left. But she made it. She pulled her boots off and lay down on the outside edge of the bed, Bodhi warm and solid against her. Jasper a quiet ridge on the far side. She pulled a blanket up over her shoulder. She expected to lie there, running numbers, the way she had every night for 16 nights, working through contingencies until dawn came and made a decision for her. She was asleep in 4 minutes. At the hearth, Garrett pulled his heavy coat from the peg and spread it on the stone floor. He lowered himself down with the careful deliberateness of a man carrying old injuries in cold weather, and lay on his back, with his arms folded across his chest. He stared at the ceiling beams in the firelight for a while. Then he closed his eyes. The blizzard worked the mountain all night long. The cabin held. The blizzard kept them in for 4 days. Not 4 days of unbroken violence. Mountain storms don't work that way. They came in waves, backing off for a morning, and then returning twice as heavy. But the trail down to Oakhaven was buried under 4 feet of new snow, and the lower switchbacks were gone entirely, and none of that mattered because none of them had anywhere to go. The cabin found its rhythm by the second morning. Maeve was up first. The fire needed rebuilding from overnight coals, and she rebuilt it the way her father had taught her: birch bark first, then loose kindling, then the larger pieces set around the outside, so the flame could breathe and establish itself before it had to work. 5 minutes, every morning. By the time Garrett came off the hearthstone, moving carefully, the cold, having worked into his joints, through another night on the stone floor, the room was warm, and the water pot was singing. She was not going to be cargo in this cabin. She had decided that on the trail up the mountain, and she wasn't revisiting the decision. She cooked 3 meals a day. She took inventory of the pantry and the root cellar below the floor and started managing the stores quietly. Beans stretched further, salt pork cut thin, the preserved vegetables rationed with precision. She found 2 of Garrett's wool shirts in the chest by the far wall with split shoulder seams, and mended both of them with thread pulled from her own hem. She swept the plank floor with a bundle of pine boughs and got the mud and pine needles outside. She relashed the deerskin over the window gap where cold air was seeping through. You don't need to do all this, Garrett said on the 3rd afternoon. I need to do something, she said, or these 4 walls are going to become a problem. He handed her an extra wooden peg from the wood bin without being asked, so she could anchor the hide at the bottom. That was the shape of it. Nothing announced. Nobody keeping a running tally. Just 2 people working toward the same end, with the most efficient combination of skills available. Jasper was chafing worse than anyone. He was 13 and restless, and he'd spent the past 3 weeks being afraid and powerless. An idle time in a small space was not improving the situation. She could see it in how he sat too still, too rigid, holding himself together by sheer force. He played dice with Bodhi for hours and let the boy win, which told her everything about how Jasper was actually feeling, because he was not under any ordinary circumstances the type to let anyone win anything. On the fourth day, during the storm's longest break, Garrett came in from the woodpile and set a .22 rifle on the table in front of Jasper. Short barrel, lever action, worn smooth from use but clean and true. He'd spent the previous evening at the table with it in pieces, working every part with an oiled cloth until the mechanism moved without any hesitation. Jasper had watched this from across the room with the focused, deliberate attention of someone pretending not to pay that much attention. "Can you shoot?" Garrett said. "Some." Jasper tried not to look excited and didn't quite manage it. "Here's what's different up here. Snowshoe hares don't sit still in a cleared field. They run tight circles in the pine thicket before they break for open ground. By the time you see one in the open, your shot's already gone." Garrett picked up the rifle, checked the chamber by habit. "You have to know where they'll come out before they're there." "How do you know that?" "You learn their runs. Same trails every day, more or less. An animal looking for food in deep snow sticks to paths that worked before. Less effort, less exposure. They're practical." He set the rifle down. "Come on." They went out together in the break between squalls, up the slope behind the cabin, toward the upper meadow. Jasper following close, and watching where Garrett put his feet as much as he was watching the terrain ahead. They were gone 2 hours. They came back with 4 snowshoe hares. Jasper carried 3 of them on a rope over his shoulder and set them on the table with what was clearly intended as everyday competence. Then he glanced at Maeve once quickly. "Clean shots," she said. "2 clean." Third one took a follow-up. He turned for the peg to hang the rifle. "I'll do better tomorrow." "Earlier tomorrow," Garrett said, pulling off his coat. "They run before the light changes. Miss that window, and you're just following tracks." "What time do they run?" "I'll wake you." Jasper turned back to the window and looked up the slope, already working through the route in his head. The depleted, hollow look that had lived on him since Oakhaven was gone. What had come back in its place was something more like intention, the particular look of a person who has a task that matters and a way to accomplish it. That evening, Maeve made stew from 2 of the hares, dried onion, and the last of the preserved carrots. The smell filled the cabin for hours, dense and warm and deeply good, the smell of food doing real work against a hard winter. Orange hearthlight moved on the ceiling, and the frost on the window glass caught it. Blue-white and intricate. Bodhi ate 2 bowls and fell asleep at the table between them. Garrett picked him up and carried him to the bed without a word, set him down, pulled the blanket up. It took less than a minute. He came back and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. He sat back down with his own cup and looked at the fire. After Jasper had settled on the stool to clean his rifle and Bodhi was fully gone, Maeve took the oilskin package out of her pack. She hadn't touched it since the night her father died. She unwrapped it on the table under the oil lamp. His handwriting looked up at her, dense, small, angled, slightly uphill, the way it always did when he was working fast and focused in the field. She turned past the first pages. Survey notation, bearing readings, mineral classifications in the shorthand he'd built across 20 years. She could read every word of it. He'd started teaching her geology when she was 12, not the formal academic kind, his kind, where rock layers ran, and what they carried, how to read the surface expressions of mineral deposits. When you learned to stop seeing ground and started seeing what lay underneath it. He'd taught her his cipher, too, because he said every good surveyor needed someone who could read their notes if they didn't come home. She had understood that as a general precaution. She turned pages, then stopped. A sketch. Rough but exact, because her father had a surveyor's precision, even working quickly. She recognized the mountain profile immediately, the northeast face of the ridge, above Oak Haven, above tree line, where the exposed fault structure showed clearly in the rock face. He'd drawn 3 convergence lines in pencil, each traced to the point where all 3 met in a V formation. Below the V, his notation for a silver-bearing formation, and beside it in his field shorthand G7 seam, 40 feet exposed. True deposit est, 10x, 10 times the exposed surface. Her father did not pad his estimates. She'd spent 4 winters in the field with him. She knew his numbers. She turned the page. The final entry, dated 5 days before he died. The pencil had pressed harder. Here she could feel the indentations through the back of the page with her fingertip. Mercer's survey man came up the ridge. Did not tell him the bearing. He knows something is here. Do not trust the company. And below that, alone on the last line, in his careful block print, the fault map is yours. Keep it from the man. She sat with it a moment, with his handwriting, with her initial. Garrett had moved around the table at some point and was standing just behind her shoulder. She wasn't sure exactly when he'd come. She could feel the warmth of him at her back, the only warmth in the half of the room away from the hearth. He was reading the page without touching anything. She pressed her finger to the stacked triangle symbol, silver-bearing formation. He used a cipher he built himself, mineral shorthand, that reads as ordinary field notes to anyone who doesn't know the system. Mercer's surveyors went up that ridge and saw meaningless marks. She moved her finger to the convergence lines. But Mercer knew something was there from the rock type and the physical formations. He just couldn't locate the vein without someone who could read my father's survey. Which is where you come in, Garrett said. Which is why Mercer invented a fraudulent debt and threatened my brothers. He didn't just want the journal. She looked at the last entry. He needed me holding it, and desperate enough to take him to the location myself. She pressed her palm flat against the page. My father knew he had 5 days, and he spent them making sure I had the proof, in a language only I could read. The fire settled behind them with a quiet sound, wood dropping in the grate. Garrett straightened up. His shadow moved off the page. She said the word aloud because it needed to exist in the air. He was murdered. Yes, Garrett said. No hesitation. He walked to the hearth and stood with one hand on the mantel, looking at the fire. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders. Whatever Mercer meant to him was sitting in that posture, contained and still and not going anywhere. She folded the oilskin back around the journal carefully. We need a plan, she said. Tomorrow, he didn't turn from the fire. Tonight you've done enough. She put the journal in her pack and went to bed. The frost on the window glass grew more elaborate in the hours before dawn, and outside the next weather system was already moving off the northwest ridge, patient and enormous. By morning, the snow was falling again. On the 7th day, the storm pulled back long enough to matter. Not fully December in these mountains didn't give you fully, but the driving snow stopped, and the wind eased from violence down to something merely brutal. And when Garrett opened the cabin door, before first light, the air outside was still and blue dark, and cold enough that it hit the skin like open water. He stood there a moment, reading the mountain. Then he reached for his coat. Trap lines, he said to the room. 4 days without checking them. I'll be back before noon. Maeve was at the stove. How far up? Upper bench, 4 miles round. She looked past him at the sky, visible above the pines, hard and blue, in the dark, that particular shade that held its own risk in mountain winter. She'd been feeling the pressure change for 2 days. 6 hours, she said, maybe 8 before the next system moves in. I'll be back in 5. He checked his rifle, loaded, and went out. The morning passed in its routine. Bodie helped her with the hardtack dough, kneading with great seriousness at the table. Jasper took his 0.22 up to the meadow edge and came back at mid-morning with 2 clean hares, skinned them at the porch rail without being told. He was building the habit on his own now, not because he was asked. because he understood it mattered. Noon came and went. She started watching the lower tree line. By 2 in the afternoon, the sky to the northwest showed that thin, milky sheet spreading over the high ridge, weather building behind it. She stood at the window with her arms crossed and her eyes on the upper trail, and she was still standing there at 2:30 when she heard him on the porch. Not footsteps. She heard the change in his breathing before he got the door open, a controlled, deliberate sound, pain being managed by nothing but will. She had the door open before he reached the latch. He came in, and she got one clear look at him in the gray afternoon light. His left shoulder and side were dark and wet under the torn canvas coat. 4 diagonal tears in the fabric, widely spaced claw marks, and deep ones. He'd wrapped his scarf around his upper arm, above the worst of it, and the wool was soaked through completely. "Cougar," he said. He sat down in the nearest chair. "Tell me what happened." "Jumped me at the 3rd trap, off a deadfall above the trail. First claw took the shoulder before I got the knife into it. I shot it, but it ran." He flexed the fingers of his left hand with careful concentration. "Deep on the shoulder. I can see that." She was already moving. "Coat off." She got both coats off him, working around the damage carefully. The flannel shirt after that. Jasper appeared at her shoulder without being summoned. She pointed at the stove without looking up. "More wood. Get it as hot as it'll go. Water on every burner." She looked toward the bed. "Bodie." "Stay there." Bodie went. Jasper moved fast and quietly. The wounds ran diagonally from the back of his left shoulder across his ribs, 4 tracks, the deepest on the outside where the first claw had landed and dragged. 2 of them showed muscle tissue. She pressed folded cloth against the worst of it, and felt him draw one short, controlled breath through his teeth and stop it there. "Where's your whiskey?" she said. "Bottom shelf. Left side." She found it. She found the salt block in the food stores and shaved brine into the first pot of hot water Jasper brought her. Then she went to the shelf above the stove and looked through Garrett's small tins and jars until she found what she needed: a jar of pine resin, dark amber and thick, the consistency of cold honey. Trappers kept it for waterproofing leather and tack, but it was also one of the oldest wound treatments in mountain country, antiseptic and sealing both. Her father had used it on a deep gash from a surveying accident when she was 14, and she'd watched every step. She set the jar near the stove to warm. "This is going to be very bad," she said, holding up the whiskey. Garrett looked at her without flinching. "I know. Do you need something, too? Just do it." She poured the whiskey directly into the deepest track. He made no sound at all. None. She cleaned each wound methodically, working out fragments of coat fiber with his smallest skinning knife, sterilized in the lamp flame and cooled in clean water. Jasper moved alongside her without being directed, reading what she needed a half step before she needed it: hot water, fresh cloth, the brine basin. He was pale, but his hands were steady. She applied the pine resin, warm, fluid, enough to work with a folded cloth, pressing it into each track. When it hit the open tissue, Garrett's right hand gripped the edge of the table, hard enough to leave white marks on the wood. He didn't make a sound. Pine resin in an open wound was not something a person endured casually. She kept her hands steady and her focus on the work, and didn't comment on what it was costing him. The stitching took over an hour. She found a curved sail needle in his tool chest, which was better luck than she'd had any right to expect. She boiled it in brine water and soaked her thread in whiskey, and worked small, tight sutures from the deepest wound outward, taking her time because a rushed stitch was worse than doing nothing. Her father had made her practice on leather until her hands moved without deliberation. She was grateful for that now. When she tied off the last suture and straightened up, Garrett's face was the color of old ash. "Bed?" she said. She and Jasper got him there together. He was heavier than he moved, the dense weight of a man built for genuine labor. They settled him against the pillow, and she pulled blankets up, and he was gone within minutes, the deep, absent sleep of a body concentrating everything it had left on the work of fighting. She sat on the stool beside the bed. The fever built through the night. She felt it before she saw it, a slight restlessness. Then the first heat off his skin when she put her palm near his forehead. By the following morning, he was radiating at a pitch she didn't like. She got cold cloth on his wrists and the back of his neck and changed it every 30 minutes. Kept the heavy blankets off his chest. The sutures were holding when she checked them. But deep lacerations in a mountain winter, carrying whatever the cougar had on its claws, were not something she could reason her way around. Infection had its own timeline, and she knew it. He was delirious by the second night. Fragmented words, not linear, a place name she didn't recognize. Cold he shouldn't have been feeling in the warmth of the cabin. Then twice, with a quiet urgency that pulled her full attention, "Get Rupert up. Get him out of the shaft." She moved the stool closer. Around midnight, he surfaced partway. His eyes opened, unfocused, moving across the ceiling. Then his gaze shifted and found her face, and whatever he was seeing when he looked at her was not quite her. His hand came to the blanket and closed around her wrist. "Rupert," he said. Low, almost a question. She didn't correct him. "I'm here," she said. His grip tightened hard once. "I'm getting you out." His voice came out rough and present and concentrated. "You hear me? We're off this mountain by morning. Just breathe, Rupe. Keep breathing." She sat completely still. Whatever was playing out behind his eyes. Whatever mountain, whatever mine, whatever night, he was living over again, for the 100th time interrupting it, felt pointless and cruel. She stayed where she was and let him get through it. After a while, his grip loosened by degrees. His eyes closed. His breathing slowed toward something more even and deep. She looked at his hand on her wrist before she moved it. Set it back down on the blanket carefully. She sat in the firelight for a long time after that, listening to the sound of him breathing. She didn't know the full story yet, but she could see the shape of it in pieces. A man who lived alone on a mountain and had lived that way for years. A man who walked into Oakhaven and spent his savings on a stranger's debt without one word of explanation, whose face went to that particular, contained place whenever Corbin Mercer's name came up in conversation. That wasn't the face of a man untouched by what Mercer did to people. That was the face of a man who had been close to it, who was still close to it. She put more wood on the fire and went back to the stool beside the bed. The third morning, the fever broke. She felt it. Before she crossed the room, a different quality of quiet from the bed, something that had settled, pressed her palm near his forehead. The heat was down, replaced by the clammy coolness of a fever finishing its work. He opened his eyes. "Morning," she said. He looked at the ceiling, then at her. He ran his own inventory of how he felt, which she could see him doing from the set of his expression. 3 days, she said before he asked. He turned his head toward the window. Sky outside was white and heavy, the next storm sitting on the mountain. "It came back last night. We're snowed in again." She poured water from the tin beside the bed. "Drink." He drank the full cup without stopping. She changed his dressings while he was awake for the first time. The wounds were better than she dared hope, for suture lines clean, the pine resin set firm, no redness spreading outward at the edges. She tied off the last bandage, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't easily name, sitting somewhere between what she recognized as gratitude and something older and more complicated. "The cougar," she said. She kept her voice steady. "But it ran. Wounded." He waited. A wounded animal bleeds the whole way down from wherever it was hit. 3 feet of fresh snow, clear sky afterward. She smoothed the edge of the bandage. A blood trail on conditions like that runs a long way. Long enough for someone lower down to follow it back to its origin. He went completely still. "I've been watching the lower tree line since yesterday morning," she said. The fire cracked in the grate. The snow was heavy on the walls outside, pressing steady and patient. Garrett looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "How long do we have?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "But we need to start thinking like we don't have much." He nodded once. All right, he said. Outside, the storm continued. The mountain offered no opinions on the matter, and no timeline, just the deep, indifferent weight of a Wyoming December, doing exactly what December in Wyoming always did. The fever had come back. She'd watched it return through the afternoon, the color dropping out of his face, the brick dust flush rising in its place, his breathing losing whatever steadiness it had found that morning. By 9 in the evening, Garrett was unconscious again, as deep and absent as he'd been. At the worst of it 2 nights before, she changed the cold cloth on his neck, checked the sutures, still holding. But deep lacerations in mountain cold, from an animal's claws, didn't give clean victories. They negotiated, and right now, the infection was renegotiating. She'd been checking the window every hour since midday. The blood trail wouldn't leave her head. 3 feet of fresh snow, hard frozen surface, clear sky after the last storm. A wounded cougar bled a long way downhill. At some point, that trail crossed whatever route Mercer had put men on, and she had no reasonable argument against the possibility that it had already happened. At 11, Jasper appeared at her elbow without being summoned. He'd been lying still on the far side of the bed for 2 hours. She'd suspected he wasn't sleeping. He stood beside her now, with his .22 barrel down in his right hand, looking at her with his father's steady eyes in a 13-year-old face. "Stay inside," she said quietly. She moved to the window and eased the deerskin aside at the edge, just enough to look out with one eye. She saw the lanterns at the tree line. 3, maybe 4, moving upslope in a loose line, the pine trunks strobing between them and the light. The wind had dropped in the last hour, and the mountain was quiet underneath the snow's whisper. And in that quiet, she could hear what didn't belong metal on metal, faint and rhythmic, and voices too far away to understand, but close enough to know they were there. She pulled the deerskin back. "Wake a Bodie. Quiet. Boots on. Coat on." She went to the stove. The iron was hot, banked hard through the night, for warmth and the kettle. She opened the iron door and looked at the coal bed inside. Dense red heat in the center, the amber ring of deep burn surrounding it. The ash shovel hung from its hook on the side wall. She lifted it off. She looked at Garrett. She could not carry him through the snow. Not far enough, not fast enough, not in time. She ran that calculation in 3 seconds and ended it there. The root cellar. She'd found it on the second day, lifting a floor section in the northeast corner, looking for stored vegetables. 6 feet down into dug earth, shelved on 2 walls, hinged planks covering it from above. She'd put the section back and thought nothing more of it. She was thinking something about it now, Jasper. She pointed at the corner, the floor planks. He found the hinged section in less than a minute. He had always had a good eye for how things were built. He got his fingers into the seam and pulled, and the section rose on its hinge, breathing cold earth air up into the room. The knock at the door wasn't a question. 3 heavy impacts. Then Mercer's voice, carrying from the porch, smooth and composed and completely certain of itself. "Miss Ross, we know you're in there. Open the door." She looked at Jasper. One finger. Wait. She set the Winchester against the wall within her reach, moved the boys to the far corner behind the bed, with a look that communicated everything without a word. Bodie pressed himself into the corner without a sound. Jasper crouched beside him with the .22 up, eyes on her. The door came open, not kicked. A pry bar at the latch. She thought it swung hard and banged the interior wall, and 2 men came through fast, spreading apart, moving like men who had done this before. The lead man was large, shotgun up. Eyes sweeping the room, she threw the coals from 6 feet. The full shovel load, dense red hot at the center, caught him across the chest and face. The sound he made was terrible. He went backward, and the shotgun hit the floor, and she was already moving, because she had 1 second. Before the second man reached her from the left, the .22 cracked from the corner behind the bed. The second man's right leg went out from under him. He caught the table edge with both hands and hung there, making a different kind of sound. The room held 1 frozen second, where everything had stopped. Mercer stood in the doorway, a fourth man behind him on the dark porch, rifle across his chest. Mercer stepped over his lead man. He crossed the floor and looked at the room, at Garrett, unconscious in the bed, at the boys in the corner, at Maeve, with an empty ash shovel in her hand and two of his hired guns on her floor. His eyes moved to the shovel. His face showed something she couldn't fully read, but it was not the flat pleasantness from the auction. Something had shifted behind it. "The ledger," he said. "Surrender yourself to my custody. I'll see to it that your brothers are placed decently." He looked at the bed. "Sterling's already done. Even if he lives through the fever, he'll freeze before spring. This doesn't have to end badly for the boys. Get your men off this floor," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the fourth man. "Take the cabin apart. We find the ledger," or he looked back at her. "We burn it and sift the ashes." She held his eyes. She spent none of the next 30 seconds on anything but moving. "Jasper, cover me." She crossed to the bed in 4 steps, got both hands under Garrett's shoulders, and understood immediately that she could not lift him alone. He was built through the chest and thighs, and he was completely dead weight. She hauled him to sitting by main force and held him there. Jasper was beside her before she called again. He read her without a word and got under Garrett's right arm, and between the two of them, they pulled him upright. His feet came off the bed. His legs held nothing. They dragged him 90 seconds across the floor, his heels tracking the boards, his head against Maeve's shoulder, the sound of boots working around the outside of the cabin growing louder. Jasper got the cellar hinge up one-handed while keeping Garrett's weight distributed on his shoulder. Boots hit the porch steps. "Down," she said. She got Garrett over the edge and down the 6 feet in as controlled a fall as 2 people could manage. He landed hard on his side. She dropped after, feet first, caught him before he rolled. Jasper handed the Winchester down butt first, then dropped in and pulled the floor panel down over them from below. The hinge seated clean and tight, dark. Above them, boots crossed the floor, more than one set. Then the door opened again and more came through. Then Mercer's voice, even and deliberate, directly overhead. "Check every plank, every seam." A pause, and get a torch. "We'll smoke them out." Maeve stood in the dark with the Winchester against her shoulder, and Garrett's breathing below her knee, and Bodie pressed against her left side, his small body completely still. She looked at nothing, which was all the dark gave her. She stayed where she was. The blizzard made the decision. She heard it coming before it arrived, the deep, harmonic pressure building in the pines above the cabin. That low sound that doesn't go through the ears cleanly, but lands somewhere lower. Then it hit the mountain all at once, whined hard enough to shudder the log walls, snow in heavy horizontal volleys. The sound of it was so complete and total that it made the root cellar, 6 feet below the floor, feel insulated from the world by more than just earth and timber. Above them, voices, arguing. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the shape of the disagreement urgency in 2 or 3 voices, something pushing back against something else. Then Mercer's, brief and flat, cutting across the rest. Then boots crossing the floor. Then the door. Then nothing but the storm. She waited 15 minutes in the dark before she believed it. Sat with the Winchester across her knees, and one ear turned toward the ceiling, counting seconds, listening for the creak of a board or a footstep that didn't belong to the wind. Silence. She let the breath out. Jasper here, close in the dark, right behind her. "You all right?" "Yes, a beat." "Bodie, he's here." "He's all right." She had her arm around the boy against her left side, had kept it there since they hit the dirt floor. His breathing was even and steady. She wasn't going to examine too closely whether that was calm or shock. It didn't matter right now. She found the matches in her coat pocket and struck one. Garrett lay on his back on the packed earth floor. Coat she'd brought down, spread over his chest. She pressed her palm near his forehead. Still burning, still deep in the fever. She pulled the coat tighter across him. The match went out. "We're here until morning." she said. Is he going to be all right? Bodhi said, a whisper small and precise. Yes, she said. She said it without any pause, and with complete certainty in her voice. She didn't know if it was true. But Bodhi was 8 years old, and he was sitting in a root cellar in the dark in a Wyoming blizzard. And there are things a child needs to hear stated without qualification. She lit another match, located a tallow candle stub on the near shelf between 2 potato sacks, and got it lit. The cellar came into pale yellow relief around them, rough walls, timber uprights, the cold-packed earth smell, their breath visible in the candlelight. Jasper settled against the near wall, with his .22 across his knees and his eyes on the ceiling. Still listening, still running the night through in his head. You did well tonight, she said. He didn't answer immediately. She let him take his time. The man I shot, he said, was in the act of harming someone. I know that. He pressed the back of his head against the earth wall. I know, you were thinking clearly while it was happening. A leg shot enough to stop him, no more than that. You made the right call in less than a second. She kept her voice even, factual. Most grown men don't manage that, Jasper. They either freeze or they go further than they should. He nodded once, a tight, considered nod. He was accepting it, not brushing it off and not inflating it. That was exactly the right response, and she was glad to see it. He settled back and watched the ceiling. Bodhi fell asleep against her arm inside 20 minutes. The candle burned. Garrett's fever broke near dawn. She felt the change before she crossed to him. His breathing shifted from the rapid, labored pattern down to something slower and deeper. She moved in the small space and pressed the back of her hand near his cheek. The burning heat had dropped. His collar was soaked through with sweat, and his skin had gone to that clammy coolness that came after a fever broke its grip. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He came to in stages, eyes opening, moving across the timber, uprights 6 inches above his face, then the earthen walls, then the candle, then her face. He looked at the cellar for a long moment. How long? He said. His voice came out rough as old gravel. Long night. Mercer brought men. We brought you down here. The boys. Both fine! Sleeping. He put his right hand to the floor and pushed himself towards sitting. She set her palm flat against his good shoulder, firm, and kept it there. Not yet, she said. Down twice in 5 days. Lie still until I say otherwise. He lay back. He looked at the ceiling. You dragged me in here, he said. Jasper helped. He was quiet, working through it. The geometry of it, a woman of 20 and a boy of 13, moving an unconscious man across a floor, and through a hatch with armed men at the door. She could see him calculating the weight of it, the time it would have taken, what it cost. Mercer's men left when the storm hit, she said. They'll be back when it clears. We need more time and a plan. I'll be on my feet by tomorrow. I'll decide that. A silence. The candle held steady in the still air of the cellar. Outside, the blizzard worked the mountain above them, steady and enormous. Then he said, Rupert. She looked at him. When the fever was high, I called you Rupert. You did, more than once, 3 times. Across 2 nights, he turned his head toward the earthen wall. She could see the set of his jaw in the candlelight, that particular stillness of a man about to say something he has kept to himself for a very long time. He was my younger brother, he said. She said nothing. 8 years ago. He was 22. He came through Oak Haven looking for mine work, which is what young men with nothing did in this territory. No money, no connections, no clear road. Mercer's labor contracts are written, so a man thinks he's signing a wage agreement. 3 months, standard rate. What he doesn't understand until he's inside the fencing is that the boarding fees, the tool fees, the lamp oil fees, all of it gets charged back against the wages. Most men come out of 3 months owing Mercer money. Then they owe 3 more months to pay the new debt, then more fees on top. He stopped. His jaw worked. Rupert was in there 18 months before I found him. The candle flame moved in a small draft from the earthen wall behind her. I got inside on a supply contract, legitimate paperwork, run through a freighter who owed me a favor. 4 trips over 6 weeks to learn the guard rotations and find the gap in the northeast fence line. His voice was level. She could hear what holding it level was costing him, but he held it. I got him out the third night of February, 8 below zero. We were 2 days into the mountain when the lung fever came on. He'd been breathing bad air in that shaft for 18 months. His lungs had nothing left in them. She sat very still. He died on the 4th morning. In a camp I'd made on the eastern ridge, I was 50 yards out, checking our back trail when it happened. A pause. He was alone for maybe 20 minutes. She reached out and took his hand, his right hand scarred across the knuckles. She held it. He didn't pull back. Every winter, I come back up here and stay up, he said, because coming down means facing the fact that he died alone on a ridge while I was 50 yards away, being careful. And there is no going back to fix any part of that. She looked at his profile in the candlelight. She thought about what she was going to say, and she took her time with it, because this was not the moment for comfort that sounds true in the dark and hollow by morning. You didn't fail, Rupert, she said. He turned his head and looked at her. You gave him the greatest gift before he died, freedom. She held his eyes steady and direct. A single day living free on this mountain is worth more than a lifetime in Mercer's mines. You're not a monster, Garrett. You're the noblest man I've ever known. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that the candle stub burned down another quarter-inch and the shadows shifted on the ceiling of the root cellar, and somewhere above them the storm drove snow against the north wall of the cabin with a sound like distant artillery. After a while, he looked back up at the ceiling. His hand didn't leave hers. Rupert would have liked you, he said. His voice had come down to something quiet, not sad exactly. Something more settled than sad. She didn't answer that. She stayed where she was, with her back against the earth wall, and his hand in hers, and the Winchester across her knees. Jasper slept. Bodhi slept. The candle burned low. She thought about what freedom costs the people who actually fight for it, not in the abstract, not in speeches, but in the specific accounting of a man who spent 6 weeks planning a rescue in mountain winter, and still could not outrun the damage that 18 months of bad air in a forced labor shaft had done to a young man's lungs. Mercer had taken Rupert's body before Garrett could get to him, and then Mercer had spent 8 years taking whatever was left. She understood now why a man spent $150 in gold on a stranger's debt without explaining himself. She didn't put Garrett's hand down until she was sure he'd gone fully under, breathing deep, and even in the earth-cold dark. Then she sat with the dying candle and waited for first light with the Winchester in her lap and the storm spending itself on the mountain above them. At dawn, the wind eased. The silence that replaced it was different from ordinary morning. Quiet. It had a specific, provisional quality, the mountain catching its breath before the next decision. She blew out what was left of the candle and started thinking about what came next. The thaw announced itself in small things first. Water running under the snow before it ran over it. You could hear it when the wind dropped, a low trickling beneath the crust that hadn't been there the week before. The light changed. December and January had a flat gray quality, the sun working from behind 2 layers of cloud, even on clear days. February's light had an edge to it, directional. The south-facing slope of the rock face above the cabin started showing bare patches by the 2nd week of the month. Garrett noticed all of it. He was fully on his feet by late January, backed by sheer determination, she thought, because the suture lines were still fresh when she found him chopping wood at the porch rail one morning, methodical and unhurried, right arm doing most of the work. She stood in the doorway for 10 seconds. He didn't stop. She went back inside. He didn't move like a man who'd been mauled 3 weeks prior. He moved like a man who had decided not to anymore. They had a conversation about Mercer on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of January. Late after the boys were settled, she'd been waiting for the right moment, which didn't arrive by waiting. So she picked a moment that was close enough and sat across the table from him. They'll come back, she said. Yes. Spring, when the lower trail's dry enough for horses. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. We could go east over the northern pass before then. File the claim documents in Cheyenne. He looked at the fire a moment, and then, what? Come back down and find Mercer waiting with a new set of papers and a judge he's already paid. She'd run that calculation many times. He has influence in Oakhaven, but Cheyenne is outside his reach. Gets you legal ownership, he said. Doesn't get you safe. He'll move on those boys the first time you're between them and him without a rifle in hand. She knew that, so we stay, she said. He looked at her directly. If you want to go east and make a real life for those boys, I want Mercer to be unable to follow us wherever we go, she said. East, west, or right here on this mountain. He was quiet a moment. Then we don't give him the mountain, he said. They started the next morning. He worked her on the Winchester for 4 days in the clearing behind the cabin. Cold, still hard, and snow waist-deep in the open meadow. She already knew the mechanism, but knowing a lever action and knowing it under pressure were two different things. He understood that distinction clearly. Don't think about the target, he said. Think about where the target is going to be. She levered around. That's easier to say than do. Everything worth doing is shoot. She shot. The shot went wide, shoulders creeping up when you fire. You're anticipating the recoil before it comes. She levered another round, took her breath out, let her shoulder go loose. Fired. The tin on the fence rail spun off into the snow. Again, he said. Again, and again after that. 3 days until her right shoulder was bruised dark from the stock, and her hands knew every catch and cam without thinking. On the 4th day, she worked moving targets, tin cans Jasper flung from the tree line one at a time, irregular intervals, no warning. 7 of 10 on the first pass. Garrett said nothing. He picked up the fallen cans and handed them back to Jasper. Again, he said. On the 5th day, they went up the mountain. The canyon choke point sat 200 yards above and east of the cabin, a natural passage, where the trail pinched between a granite outcrop on the left and a steep ice-rimed slope on the right. Nothing wider than 2 horses abreast. The only viable route up from the lower valley. She'd given it a name without intending to. The ice chute. Garrett showed her the fracture lines in the granite overhang above the passage. Old fractures, deep and wide, the kind that shifted every spring when the freeze-thaw cycle worked at them. He traced the main crack with one finger. A rope tied here, he said. Run across to that pine. The outcrop reads as a windfall barrier, looks like trail maintenance. Man on a horse coming up sees something to move, but it's connected to the overhang. Pull the rope, and the wedge stones come out first. Takes the face with them. Jasper had climbed up to study the fracture from above and came back with snow in his collar and a particular look on his face. The look of a boy who has understood something that pleases him. I can rig the rope from up top, he said. Pull points on the eastern side. Out of the line of fire, Garrett considered this. Yes, Jasper nodded and went back up. They spent 3 days rigging the canyon. Rope triggers at 2 points. The rock slide mechanism above the choke point, a secondary ice trap, lower on the trail, a buried rope across the iced surface that would take a horse's front legs on the run. Simple, effective. The kind of defense that didn't require being in 2 places at once. Maeve worked alongside him, carrying stone, driving iron stakes into frozen ground, testing rope tensions. Her hands went hard and raw in the cold. She kept working. On the last evening, she stood with Garrett at the choke point looking down the canyon. The valley below was still in white. The trail was invisible under the snow. Somewhere down there, eventually, something would start moving up. Peace isn't earned by begging, she said. He turned to look at her. I tried that, in the land office, at the clerk's desk, outside the judge's chamber. She looked down the canyon. I begged every door I could find. Every door stayed shut. They always do, he said. People who hold power over others don't let go because someone asks them to. She tested the rope tension on the near stake with one firm pull. The only thing that ever made Mercer hesitate was when you put a knife in his table. He was quiet. I'm not talking about cruelty, she said. I'm talking about being strong enough that cruelty becomes inconvenient to aim at you. That's the only argument men like Mercer ever actually heard. He looked at the canyon for a long while. No argument in the world stops a man like that forever, he said. But it buys time, and time on this mountain tends to run in our favor. She accepted that. It was honest. They walked back down to the cabin in the late light. Snow blue in the shadow and gold where the sun still reached it above them. The mountain belonged to them. For now, they intended to keep it that way. They came on a Wednesday. Garrett heard them. First. He came off the porch steps in the early afternoon and stood in the clearing with his head slightly turned, not looking at anything in particular. How many? Maeve said from the doorway. 5 horses, maybe 6, moving up the lower switchback. He looked at the sun. 2 hours above the ridgeline. They timed it for daylight. They know the trail. They moved without wasted conversation. Jasper took Bodie to the fortified position behind the wood store on the north side of the cabin. Thick stacked cordwood at chest height, solid as any wall. Clear sightline to the cabin approach and hard cover from the canyon direction. Jasper had the .22 and 20 rounds and a set of instructions he'd already memorized. He nodded once and went. Garrett covered the choke point from the granite outcrop left of the pass, high ground. Good angle. The full length of the ice chute visible below him. His rifle and the rope trigger were within arm's reach. He checked both, settled in. Maeve took the high eastern rocks. The climb was steep, and she made the last section on hands and knees, rifle slung across her back, working through snow that shifted under her weight. She came over the eastern rim above the ice chute and found her position a flat shelf of granite 40 feet above the trail, solid underfoot, angled, so she was looking down the full length of the passage. She could see the cabin from here. The approach trail, the entire geometry of the ground below. Mercer came through the lower tree line at 3 in the afternoon. He rode a gray horse, clean dressed as always, flanked by 4 men. A 5th led a mule carrying supplies. She tracked him through the Winchester's sights and recognized the shape of the load on the mule. A barrel. Black powder, she thought. Enough to blow the cabin door off its frame and likely half the north wall with it. He wasn't planning on asking this time. The first 2 riders entered the ice chute at a steady pace, horses picking careful steps on the ice. The 3rd followed. Mercer held back at the entry with the remaining man and the mule. Garrett waited until all 3 horses were inside the passage. The rope pulled taut and the wedge stones dropped, and the mountain made its own decision. The sound was nothing like a gunshot. Lower and bigger, coming from everywhere at once, a grinding, tearing roar as the granite face released. The 3 horses screamed and spun. 1 man went down immediately, rolled clear by instinct or luck. The rock fall hit the ice chute in a solid wave, ice debris billowing through the passage in a white cloud. Mercer's gray horse reared hard at the entry. He fought it down, looked up, then pulled the mule forward. Maeve was already sighting on the barrel, not a long shot. 60 yards, downhill, clear air. She took her breath out, kept her shoulder loose. Let her hands do what they'd learned in the clearing behind the cabin, repeated until the motion lived in her bones. She fired. The black powder keg took the round dead center, and the world below her turned white. The concussion hit her chest from 60 yards up. She pressed herself flat against the rock shelf and rode it. When she looked up, the mule was gone. The blast had taken the trail surface at the ice chute entry in a column of fire and ice and blown debris in every direction. 2 of Mercer's men were down on the slope. The blast had also shaken loose the overhanging snow. On the upper eastern face, the snow came down in a sheet. Not fast at first, then all at once, the way a heavy thing commits to falling. It took the remaining debris, the loose stone, the ice fragments from Garrett's slide, everything combined, and moved down the canyon in a grinding, churning wave that buried the choke point and spilled across the approach trail below it. The roar built and then faded. Then the mountain went quiet. Complete, crisp silence, the particular touch that only follows something enormous. Maeve stood up slowly from the rock shelf. One man was pulling himself out of the snow on the lower slope, moving alive. Another lay on his back and wasn't moving. The ice chute was gone, filled entirely. No passage visible. The approach trail below it lay buried under 6 feet of mixed snow and rubble. Garrett's voice carried across the canyon. Maeve. Here, she called back. You all right? Yes, she was already scanning below for Mercer. She found him 40 yards below the blast site. The gray horse was gone, bolted down the mountain when the keg went. Mercer sat in the snow, one arm at an angle she recognized as broken, his coat torn open across the shoulder. His revolver was 10 feet from his hand, buried to the grip in snow. He was breathing. He was watching her position at the rim, tracking her without being able to do anything about what he saw. Garrett came down from the outcrop and crossed to him through the snow. Mercer looked up at him. Something moved through his expression, the face of a man who has built his world on other people's inability to hold a line and has just encountered one they held. This mountain is a federal territorial land survey claim, Garrett said, registered in the name of Elias Ross. His legal heir intends to file documentation in Cheyenne within the month. He crouched in front of him, steady and direct. You're going to wait here until you're recovered enough to ride out. Then you're going to take whatever remains of your operation in Oakhaven and direct it toward anything other than this mountain or this family. Mercer said nothing. It's December, Garrett said. He stood. I'd make a decision before dark. He turned and walked back toward the cabin without looking back. Maeve came down from the eastern rocks. She crossed the approach trail and fell into step beside him through the deep snow. The echo of the slide had long since crossed the valley and dissolved into the broader silence of the Absarokas, which had heard larger things in their time and absorbed them all without comment. She didn't look back either. Spring came to the Absarokas the way it always did, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm day, then 2 cold ones. Snow pulling back from the south-facing rocks, then returning halfway. The creek coming alive under its ice crust first, then the ice breaking apart in sections over a week. The aspens were the last and most decisive sign. When their buds went from tight gray to a pale green haze across the upper slopes, you could trust it. Spring had made its decision. The territorial documents came up from Cheyenne in the 2nd week of April. A rider from the Oakhaven post office made the climb with a mail packet tied to his saddle. He handed it to Maeve at the cabin door, accepted coffee, and rode back down the thawing trail without much commentary on what he'd delivered. She sat at the table and read every line, the full claim survey, her father's field notations, reproduced in the official record, the certificate of legal inheritance, her name at the top in clean territorial print. She set it flat on the table and left her palms on it for a while. The silver was hers. The mountain was hers. Every year her father had spent walking these ridges with a compass and a journal and a surveyor's eye. For what lay beneath the surface those years had become this document, and this document was on her table. Corbin Mercer had been transported to the county seat in Laramie in late February. The territorial marshal had made the trip up once the lower trail dried enough, bringing depositions from 2 men who had survived Mercer's labor camps and would testify in court. She'd given her own statement, filed it properly, and released it to the process. What happened after that was the court's business. She had other work to do. May arrived warm and fast. The wildflowers came all at once when they came. The mountain didn't do gradual with color. Yellow and white first on the meadow edge, then the blue ones up near the granite outcrops, then the full open meadow below the cabin in every direction. Bodie found all of them within an hour of the first real warm morning, cataloging each one with a field gravity that made him look, in brief flashes, exactly like his father. Jasper had built a trap line of his own in the upper meadow. 4 sets, checked daily. He kept his own records in a small notebook Garrett had handed him without comment one February morning. Catches, conditions, times, weather. 14 years old now, running a proper line and maintaining written records and doing all of it without being reminded. Maeve stood on the porch in the May morning sun and watched the boys in the meadow and understood fully for the first time that they were going to be all right. Not fine, not surviving. Actually, all right, the real kind. Then she heard the saddlebags hit the porch rail behind her. She turned. Garrett was working the straps on his heavy pack, 2 full saddlebags laid out, the brown horse hitched at the post below the steps. He moved around the horse, checking the cinch, testing the load balance, unhurried, systematic. She looked at the saddlebags, then at him. "Where?" she said. "Town." Then back. He checked the near strip leather. Some paperwork with the land office. Freight order that's been sitting in Oakhaven since January. He paused. "I also have a bank draft for you." He came back to the porch and laid an envelope on the rail. She didn't pick it up. "Enough to get you and the boys to Denver," he said. "Rail east from there. School for the boys. Proper schooling. A house in a real town. The silver claim is filed and will produce income once you get an assayer and a proper operation in order." He straightened. "You don't need this mountain to survive anymore, Maeve. You earned a normal life." He went back to the pack straps. She looked at the envelope on the rail. She looked at the meadow, where Bodie was showing Jasper something in the grass, and Jasper was crouching down to see it. She looked back at the draft. "What's a normal life down there?" she said. He kept working the strap, watching my father get swindled. Her voice was even, not raised, being put on an auction block like livestock. She came off the porch post. "I've lived that life, Garrett. There is no respect down there." He stopped working the strap. He straightened. He was looking at the horse, not at her. "Up here there's only dirt, cold, and hard labor," he said. She crossed the porch until she was standing in front of him. She put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, exactly there. She felt it beating under her palm, the steady, real, irreducible fact of it. "I don't mind the labor," she said, "as long as it's mine by choice." She held his eyes and said the rest of it the way she would state a surveyor's finding or a court document clearly, without qualification. "For the record, I am not your property, nor am I your burden. I am your equal partner if you're brave enough to have me." He looked at her. He looked at her long enough that the spring air moved through the pines above the cabin, and the creek ran somewhere below, and the meadow held the boys and the wildflowers and the morning light, and all of it continued regardless, patient as the mountains that had stood here long before either of them arrived and would stand long after. Then his arms came around her, not tentative, not uncertain. He held her the way a man holds something he has decided to stop being afraid of. His chin came to the top of her head. She pressed her hand harder against his chest and felt the exhale move through him deep and slow, as if he had been carrying the breath for a very long time and had finally found somewhere to set it down. The ice in him broke the way the creek ice had broken. Not all at once, then all at once. They stood on the porch of the cabin he had kept through many hard winters alone. On the mountain she had climbed in freezing rain with her brothers and a 3-inch folding knife and $12 stitched into her coat lining, while down in the meadow Bodie ran through the wildflowers at full speed, and Jasper jogged behind him, looking like exactly what he was, a boy in spring sunlight, running because the ground was clear and the air was warm, and there was nowhere else he needed to be. Garrett's hand moved to the back of her head and rested there, gentle and certain. She turned her face toward the meadow and looked at her brothers in the flowers and felt the sun on her skin. The silver was in the mountain. The claim was in her name. The boys were right there, visible and free. She was nobody's debt, nobody's transaction, nobody's contracted labor. She was Maeve Ross, 20 years old, standing on her own porch at the top of the Absarokas in May, held by a man who had walked into Oakhaven and spent his savings on a principle because he understood in his bones that human beings could not be bought or sold or reduced to a number on a paper debt, who had given her brothers back on a rainy December street and asked for nothing, who had lain on his own stone floor for weeks so children could sleep in a real bed, and taught a 13-year-old boy to read trail signs in the snow and said without ceremony, "Raging at the weather won't keep you warm, kid. Only taking the next step keeps your heart beating." She turned her face up and looked at him. He looked back at her. The mountain held them in its permanent, indifferent way, the way it held everything, without preference, without transaction, without anything owed or owing in either direction, equal under the open sky, exactly as it should be. Before we close out today's story, I want to sit with you here for just a moment. Because this one wasn't just a tale about a woman on a whiskey barrel in the freezing rain, or a mountain man with gold coins and a hunting knife. It was about something older and more important than any of that. Maeve Ross had nothing, no money, no legal standing, no one in her corner. The system that was supposed to protect her, the courts, the sheriff, the land office, had been bought out from under her before she even knew the game was being played. And when she ran out of doors to knock on, she did the only thing she had left. She stood up straight and refused to let them see her cry. That is not weakness. That is the specific, quiet, grinding courage that most of us never talk about. The kind that doesn't look heroic from the outside. The kind that just keeps going because the alternative is unthinkable. And then Garrett Sterling walked in, not to rescue her. He was very clear about that. He walked in because he had looked at what was happening and decided, without drama and without negotiation, that he would not be a bystander to it. He spent his savings on a principle. He drove a knife into a table for a stranger's dignity. And then he went right back to checking his mule's cinch straps. That is what moral courage actually looks like in practice. It is not a speech. It is a choice made in real time that costs you something real. What this story asks each of us to consider is simple. Who in your life is standing on a barrel right now, holding themselves together, refusing to let anyone see the tears? And what are you willing to spend, not money necessarily, but time, discomfort, the safety of staying quiet to walk through that crowd and say, "Not today"? Because the other thing this story teaches us, the thing Maeve understood by the end, is that freedom is not given. It is not granted by courts or sheriffs or the goodwill of powerful men. It is secured. It is built, rope by rope, stake by stake, through the cold ground of a Wyoming winter, by people who love something enough to stand in front of it and hold the line. She was not his property. She was not his burden. She was his equal. And she was brave enough to say so out loud, on her own porch, in the spring sunlight, on her own terms. That is the story. That is what we carry out of it. Thank you for spending this time with us today. We will see you in the next one. This story is a work of historical fiction created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. All characters, events, and locations depicted are fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental.